Imagine discovering that a single corporation literally bought a president, not through traditional lobbying or campaign donations, but through a systematic, multi-million-dollar secret operation to place and maintain a man in power. This actually happened in Brazil between 2003 and 2016. Odebrecht, a construction giant, created the largest scheme to buy political influence in modern history. They literally bought a president, kept him in power, and profited billions from this operation. The president was Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and I will show you exactly how a corporation secretly bought the most powerful man in Brazil. I will reveal the internal documents, secret spreadsheets, code names, luxury apartments, and the bribery department that made this purchase possible. I will show how this operation corrupted Brazil and spread throughout Latin America, toppling presidents and destroying entire economies. And I will explain how, even after being exposed, arrested, and convicted, Lula returned to power in 2022. Raising suspicions that the corruption cycle has restarted. This is how a Brazilian company proved that with enough money and the right strategy, you can buy even a president. The most frightening part is that this story continues happening now while you watch this video. Lula was not just any politician. He was Latin America's most charismatic leader, rising from poverty to become president of South America's largest country. And Odebrecht was not just any company. It was a construction empire operating in 12 countries with revenues exceeding $40 billion at its peak. To put that in perspective, this single Brazilian construction company generated more revenue than global giants like Coca-Cola or McDonald's. It was an economic force larger than the entire GDP of nations like Paraguay or Bolivia. To understand how Odebrecht bought a president, we need to go back to the early 2000s when two powerful forces met in Brazil. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a former metalworker turned charismatic politician, and Odebrecht, a construction company about to become Latin America's largest contractor. When Lula assumed the presidency in 2003, he brought a grandiose vision for Brazil. He wanted to transform the country into a global power through mega infrastructure projects. The Growth Acceleration Program planned investments of more than 500 billion reais in public works. For Odebrecht, this represented a historic opportunity. Under Marcelo Odebrecht's leadership, the founder's grandson, the company developed a revolutionary strategy. Instead of just competing for public contracts, Odebrecht would decide who won them. Instead of just influencing politicians, they would buy them. Instead of just doing business with the government, they would become part of it. The first step was creating a special relationship with Lula. Odebrecht began financing not only the Workers' Party campaigns, Lula's political party, but also his personal projects. They financed the Lula Institute, paid millionaire speaking fees, and offered increasingly valuable gifts. Odebrecht's genius was realizing that to control a president, you need to create a system where he depends on you to stay in power. In Brazilian politics, money is not just influence, it is oxygen. Without it, political careers suffocate and die. The relationship became so intimate that Odebrecht executives had direct access to the presidential palace. They participated in government meetings, influenced policy decisions, and became shadow advisors to the president. This was not lobbying in the American sense. This was corporate colonization of the Brazilian state. But how do you manage bribery on an industrial scale without leaving a trail? You institutionalize it, giving it a name so sterile and corporate, it becomes invisible. In 2006, Odebrecht created its ultimate weapon, hiding in plain sight, the structured operations sector. To the outside world, a simple international business unit. In reality, the most sophisticated bribery department in modern corporate history. The department was commanded by Gilberto Mascarenhas, reporting directly to Marcelo Odebrecht. They developed a system so sophisticated it seemed from a spy movie. Each important politician had a code name. Lula was friend, Dilma Rousseff was Madame, José Dirceu was Italian. They maintained detailed spreadsheets with amounts paid, favors received, and upcoming investments in each politician. The system worked through a network of offshore companies worldwide. Odebrecht created more than 100 shell companies in tax havens like Panama, British Virgin Islands, and Switzerland. Bribery money was laundered through overpriced contracts in international projects. Between 2005 and 2014, the structured operations sector paid out over $3.3 billion in bribes. This isn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it's a river of illicit cash. It equates to over $1 million paid out every single day for 9 consecutive years. A budget large enough to fund the construction of 3 Golden Gate bridges from scratch, all weaponized to systematically corrupt governments across an entire continent. For Lula specifically, Odebrecht developed a special benefits package. They financed the renovation of a triplex apartment in Guarujá that would be transferred to Lula after his presidency. They also paid for improvements to a country estate in Atibaia, frequented by his family. The most shocking aspect is that all of this was treated as normal business investment. In board meetings, executives openly discussed how much money was necessary to maintain each politician and what returns they expected from each investment. They had PowerPoint presentations showing return on investment for each bribe paid. Odebrecht's investment in Lula delivered spectacular returns. The company that in 2002 had revenues of 4 billion reais reached 2014 with revenues of 42 billion reais. Growth of more than 1,000% in 12 years through buying political influence. Odebrecht secured billionaire contracts in practically all major government projects under Lula: the Abreu e Lima refinery, the Rio de Janeiro petrochemical complex, the Belo Monte hydroelectric plant, the Corinthians Arena for the World Cup. In each project, Odebrecht was present, often leading consortiums of other contractors also involved in the scheme. But the real treasure was Petrobras, Brazil's state-owned oil company. Under directors appointed by the Workers' Party, Petrobras approved overpriced contracts that generated losses of more than 40 billion reais for the company and the Brazilian people. The scheme worked devastatingly effectively. Odebrecht and other contractors formed cartels to divide Petrobras contracts. They agreed on who would win each bid and at what price. Prices were always inflated, and the difference was divided between companies and politicians who facilitated contracts. To keep Lula satisfied, Odebrecht spared no expense. Besides direct benefits like the triplex and country estate, they financed international trips for Lula's family, paid millionaire consultancies for his friends, and funded family social events. This system became so institutionalized, it survived the transition from Lula to Dilma Rousseff. The new president, also from the Workers' Party, maintained the same scheme, ensuring Odebrecht continued profiting billions from public contracts in exchange for bribes and political financing. Odebrecht was essentially running a parallel government. They had more influence over infrastructure policy than most government ministers. They decided which projects would be built, where, and how much they would cost. They transformed the Brazilian state into their private profit machine, with Lula as their chief enabler and protector. The empire seemed indestructible until 2014, when a federal police operation called Car Wash began unraveling the largest corruption scheme in Brazilian history. What began as money laundering investigation at a Brasília gas station transformed into an avalanche that would topple presidents, imprison billionaires, and expose the rot in the Brazilian political system. The first major blow came with Paulo Roberto Costa's arrest, former Petrobras director, in 2014. Under pressure, he revealed details of the bribery scheme. Next came Alberto Youssef, a money changer who operated the laundering. But the real earthquake happened when Odebrecht executives decided to make plea bargains. Marcelo Odebrecht was arrested in June 2015. Initially resistant, when he realized evidence against him was overwhelming and other executives were negotiating plea deals, he decided to tell everything. Odebrecht's plea bargain was devastating. They handed over detailed spreadsheets with all payments to politicians, including dates, amounts, and transfer methods. They revealed the bribery department's existence, explained the codename system, and provided evidence of payments in 12 countries. For Lula, revelations were particularly damaging. Odebrecht executives confirmed they had financed the Guarujá triplex renovation specifically for the former president. They revealed payments for Atibaia estate improvements and described meetings where Lula personally requested favors in exchange for public contracts. In March 2016, Lula was coercively taken by federal police for testimony. Images of the former president being escorted by federal police shocked Brazil and the world. In July 2017, Judge Sergio Moro convicted him to 9 years and 6 months in prison for passive corruption and money laundering. In April 2018, Lula surrendered to federal police and was imprisoned in Curitiba. The man who had been president of Brazil and Latin America's most influential politician became the country's most famous prisoner. The story should have ended with Lula in prison and Odebrecht destroyed. But in Brazil, corruption stories never really end. They hibernate before resurging with new packaging. In 2021, the Supreme Federal Court annulled Lula's convictions, alleging Judge Sergio Moro lacked competence to judge the case. The controversial decision divided the country but had immediate practical effect. Lula was free to run for president again. In 2022, in one of Brazil's most polarized elections, Lula defeated Jair Bolsonaro by a narrow margin and returned to power. His campaign was based on the narrative that he had been a victim of political persecution. Meanwhile, Odebrecht underwent complete restructuring. The company changed its name to Novonor, fired hundreds of employees, and sold various assets. Officially, it had transformed into a clean company committed to transparency and ethics. But suspicions that the old system was returning didn't take long to materialize. The fiscal situation began deteriorating sharply. After Bolsonaro left a rare government surplus in 2022, Lula's first year back in 2023 closed with a massive deficit of 230 billion reais. The trend continued into 2024, and now, as we stand in late 2025, the country faces alarming projections. The International Monetary Fund forecasts a nominal deficit nearing 9% of GDP, pushing public debt towards a staggering 80% of the entire economy. A fiscal time bomb ticking louder every day. Signs emerged that old practices were returning. New scandals involving state companies, Workers' Party ministers being investigated, and public contracts directed to companies with corruption histories. Odebrecht, now Novonor, returned to winning public contracts. The company that should have been banned from the Brazilian public system for decades managed to rehabilitate itself in record time. Coincidence? Or evidence that the system of buying political influence never really died? What we learned is terrifying. In Brazil, corruption is not a bug in the political system. It is a feature. When politicians and business people discover they can literally buy presidents without real consequences, they just wait for the storm to pass to start over. The most chilling aspect isn't just that a corporation bought a president. It's the revelation of a terrifying blueprint, a playbook showing how any corporation with enough money and the right strategy can capture a government and turn it into a private profit machine. The Odebrecht case proved that punishment for this capture is temporary, but the system that allows it is permanent. It doesn't just regenerate like a virus. It learns, adapts, and waits for the next opportunity, perhaps under a new name, with new faces, but with the same insatiable greed. If you want to understand more about the backstage of corporate and political power, subscribe to the Dark Suits channel. Every week, new dossiers about the scandals that shape our world.